Welcome back to MiniJunkie, everyone. My name is Jarrett. Real quick, I'm going to be painting up the Cypher Lords using a mix of regular paints and contrast paints and also some Colorshift paints from Green Stuff World. I'll link to those down below in the description if you're interested. These are, you can apply them with airbrush and regular brush according to their instructions. I do tend to prefer using an airbrush for that, but I'll show you how I do that while maintaining the ability to still use contrast paints and regular paints. These guys just seem suitable for using like the color shift idea, given that they're all about trickery and mind-bending illusions and things like that, as far as I could tell anyway. Hey, if you're new to the channel, consider subscribing for everything related to the hobby of painting miniatures for display or wargaming or board gaming. All right, let's get right into it. So here's a quick look at the warband I'll be painting in this video and the final result. So I decided to use the Colorshift paints on these, but wasn't sure which ones. So I sprayed one of the non-English Warcry cards with black and a bit of gloss, and I tried these out. I think I've got Nebula Copper on there. I'm not sure what the other ones were, but the Celestial Azure is the bluish one in the corner there, and then Psychotic Illusion is the more whitish one in the center, that circle, and those are the two I decided to use. Azure for the headdresses and Psychotic Illusion for the weapons. So it's interesting because what I was trying to do is use the Colorshift paints on parts of them, and then I wanted the ability to still use contrast paints on the rest of the miniature, and those ideally you're going to want like a light primer, like a white or something, or gray sear, for example. So here you see what I've done is primed anything I wanted to use Colorshift on has been primed black, and then what I've done is, and just left everything else unprimed for now, and then I've gone through and added a coat of gloss over that. And there's a bit of overspray for sure that's going to get corrected later. Started with the weapons. I'm using Psychotic Illusion through my airbrush at a lower PSI, I want to say like in the 20 range. And I put some white paper down because I didn't want to get it all over my green cutting mat that I've been using as a backdrop. And basically what you want to do here is go through and do very light coats, let them dry between coats. And it's tough because at first it hardly shows up on the black, I found, especially on a small surface. So working with these small surfaces was interesting with the Colorshift paint in the sense that there's not a lot of range you can get in terms of movement and seeing the different colors show up. I think it's less than if you had like a large flat surface to work with or a curved surface. But nonetheless, I kept going and spraying each weapon with it in thin coats, letting it dry between each coat. Sprayed it on the bladed fan of the Thrallmaster. I'm not sure if it really works great on that particular weapon, but I wanted to be consistent and use it on all the weapons, so I did so here. Once the weapons were done, it was time to move on to the headdresses, helmets. I don't know what to call these things. And I didn't really want to mask the weapons off yet, but I wanted to obviously not get this azure color on them. So I just sprayed it, same thing, thin coats from the airbrush, letting each coat dry before applying another one. I'd say 7 or 8 coats was likely what I did. I lost count and sometimes probably did less and sometimes more. And at first it does look a little speckly, and so the more coats you apply, the more that starts to smooth out. And you can see occasionally I had put tape behind the headdress if a weapon was poking up behind their head, because you didn't want that blue to go right past the headpiece and land on the weapon you finished previously, or that I finished previously. I'm trying to show you the color shift in this video by moving the pieces around. It's really tough to do. It doesn't come through great. Here you can sort of see how the blue trends towards purple and how the weapons sometimes go from almost like a dark bluish to a purple, depending on the angle. It's pretty cool in person, but it's tough to show off in the video. Because I'm going to be priming everything else in a white color. And here you can see I'm using Tamiya masking tape. Comes in a few different sizes that are really good for hobby use on miniatures. You can obviously use painter's tape, but it's pretty big and you're going to be cutting off little pieces to do it. So I found these sizes just right to you know, for example, for these headpieces, I would come across on 2 different diagonals and then go across the front with a smaller piece just to catch the, because of the curve of the helmet. And really just basically masking off all the work we've done so far with the Colorshift. So masking the helmets off, and it's only on the front. I decided not to do that on the backs. And then masking off the weapons right from the hilt as close as possible. And a few times I think I did maybe miss a tiny spot here and there near the hilts, but I sort of lay it along the length of the blade and then wrap it around, maybe cut off the excess. Each one was done a little bit differently. The key here being just to be sure that you've masked off as much as possible and not leaving anything showing, because whatever's showing of your Colorshift is going to get white on it once you start to prime. So here's a couple of examples of what this looks like once the masking is done, whether it be on double-bladed weapons or on the helmets and things like that. I pretty much believe that any white primer or light color primer works with these contrast paints, so I've gone ahead and used Vallejo Premium White Primer, and here you can see I've sprayed it on after having done the masking, and now I'm super impatient, so I pulled the masking off. Don't really want to paint them with all the masking in place. I'm done with the airbrush, so given that I'm going to be doing all normal brush work, I just didn't want all that unsightly masking tape in the way and just having to work around it and stuff. So I do peel all the masking tape off at this point, holding my breath a little. I did leave the color shifts overnight to really cure and dry as much as possible before doing this step, because I was a little scared that the masking tape could pull off the paint. So for their, I guess, cloth bits, I decided to use a mix of 50% green, 50% blue of the Vallejo Game Ink. Works a heck of a lot like contrast paint. Little differences here and there. I'd say it dries a little faster, so you could potentially be more prone to streaking if you don't move quickly. Also, though, a little more resilient. I have noticed that the contrast paints are fairly fragile after you apply them and before you've had a chance to varnish anything. But the turquoise contrast paint wasn't quite the right shade I was looking for. It was close, and I wanted something a little bit bluer, and that's how I arrived at this mix, and I was pretty happy with this mix of the inks. But yeah, you just basically go through and be neat and stay inside the lines. Contrast paints or this type of ink shading is kind of like a coloring book. You just apply the paint inside the lines of any particular areas. So here it gets a little finicky around their waists, where you start to get the strips that show a little bit of skin in between. But you just have to sort of eyeball it and see where is supposed to be flesh showing through and where is supposed to be the cloth, and just work your way through the whole batch. The leader has 3 layers of cloth, and I wanted it to look similar but not quite exactly the same as the rest of the unit. So just added like a drop of black, maybe 2 drops, I can't recall, because black goes a long way with these inks. It could really darken it. I think it was probably 1 drop. And the same thing, just applying it over this first layer of his cloth, which is the upper part, and doing this sort of blackish, greenish, bluish. I really like how it looks. It's similar to Stegodon Scale Green, I would say, from GW. Eventually, though, I end up putting it around the, wrapping around to the inside of his cloth or his cape. I don't know what they call these things he's wearing, robes. And that's supposed to be white. So what I ended up doing is very quickly rinsing my brush and applying water and trying to wipe as much of that off so that I could come back later and fix it with white. So you'll see that in a sec here, I think. Next I did the straps with Black Templar, and when I use these contrast paints, I'm using them right out of the bottle neat without any water. If I do use, or sorry, any thinner or contrast medium, and if I do use some, I'll tell you. But I don't think I used any on these Cypher Lords. I found this step so incredibly tedious. Each guy or girl has like 3 straps on each limb. The straps are quite close together, and so applying this and not just obliterating the white between them where where the flesh needs to show through was fairly painstaking. It just seemed to go on and on. So didn't super enjoy this step, but in the end it's worth it to go through it and just bite the bullet and zone out and just get through it, because it does look good having each strap painted individually as opposed to just, you know, blobbing it on and getting rid of all the spots of skin in between each strap, which I think you should leave that showing because it looks stylish on these guys. Any of the wrapped weapon handles, I used Vallejo Game Ink Violet. I think it looks really good. It goes on, again, very much like a contrast paint, very bright and vibrant while still having lots of darkness, you know, in the little individual strap recessed areas. So what I'm trying to say is it pulls out the texture nicely while still being quite bright. And I think the color looks nice with these sort of blue-greens that we're using. Or they clash, I don't know, my color theory's iffy at best, but I think it looks pretty good. Then I took chainmail. So chainmail is an old color from Citadel, but effectively it's like I'd say it's like a Runefang steel. It's kind of a mid-range, so it's not as dark as gunmetal, but it's not as bright as like a Stormhost silver. A little bit of water to help this flow a little better. Sometimes metallics work well with water as a thinner. Sometimes they don't, as in the case of Scale 75, I find it kind of destroys them. And really, I just took a brush and went through and applied this all over any of the armor, which is primarily on shoulders and a little bit of the sort of torso. And also the round, sort of central round part of each of their like fancy belt buckles. While I had that silvery color in my palette, I decided to kind of do a little bit of an edge highlight along each of the blades of the leader's fan, just to help pull those blades out and distinguish them a little bit from each other, because the color shift treatment I don't want to do a wash over these because it could interfere with the color shift properties. So you don't want to like throw a Nuln oil over top of this. It's going to matte it down too much. So to separate them, I just did a little bit of edge highlight across the top of each blade. For all the golds on their armor, I decided, you know, this is primarily the trim of each helmet, like the edge of each helmet, and there's little bits of trim across all their different pieces of armor and little trinkets and things. All of those little sort of eye danglies that they have on their helmets and belts and whatnot. And also, of course, the main faceplate and helmet of the helmet. So this will take a couple coats, let's call it 2 thin coats, to cover up any of the color shift paint that's gotten on the top of the helmet. And because a little bit of that dark bluish is going to show through at first, probably your first coat of Retributor armor. This is a great paint, though, one of the best golds that, you know, pot-based golds as opposed to airbrush that I think you can get. I think it's just great stuff. It's not liquid gold from Vallejo in its properties, but it's also quick and easy to use. It's water-based. Goes on, creates a nice smooth coat. Yeah, so just go through, and you want to be obviously very careful and slow. Take your time around any of the color shift work you've done earlier. If you did use it, if you didn't, maybe be more sloppy, because any mistakes you make at this point on your color shift are gonna be super hard to fix. You can hand brush it, but I think it just isn't quite as effective as the initial airbrush layer that's been done. I originally had hoped to do this sort of black and purple striping that these guys have in the official paint job on these big head plumes that they're wearing. I don't think it's their hair. I could be wrong. Anyway, I really like the purple and I like the black and purple, but I found that black trick to be just a little bit hard for me to nail it as I tried to swirl it around the different strands. So I gave that up pretty quickly after my first test and just went to straight shaiish purple on these, and it, you know, it's contrast paint right out of the pot. Looks great. Actually, it dries looking really nice, but it's super fragile, right? It's not very resilient. So even the slightest touch of your finger on there, even when it's dried quite a bit, can rub some off, which I was finding to be a pain because I kept accidentally touching it. And yes, I should be using figure holders, but when I do a full unit, I often don't. Here you can see anyway that I've taken Nuln Oil Gloss and I'm just applying this to any of the silver armor to bring in some depth and some shading. I don't tend to use plain Nuln Oil, the non-gloss, simply because that really dulls down metallics a lot and it's usually not the effect I'm going for. So I tend to use the glosses when it comes to any kind of metallics. And I applied that to any of the silver, including on the belt. Now I did a wash on the gold, and I'm using a bit of a custom mix that's 2/3 Agrax gloss and 1/3 Reichland Flesh Shade gloss. Both are gloss, as I said, because the regular shades will dull down your metallics, and I didn't want to dull down the golds. But I did want to shade them a little bit, so I took this and right out of the pot, no thinning, I just applied it to all the gold areas. And it's particularly important to do this on that helmet because of that, you know, that cheekbone effect they have going. You want that shading under the cheekbones. It's a really nice way of showing the contours of the faceplate. So you want to do that, but also wick it up a little bit if it's too much. If it starts to make a really deep pool in the cheek area, you don't want that. So just eyeball it and go for what feels right for you. This step's pretty straightforward. I went for a blue ink, Vallejo Game ink, for his second layer of cloth. That's sort of just showing beneath the first top layer of cloth he's wearing. I don't know how to describe this guy's clothes. And again, this is one where you could use, there's different contrast paints that might look nice with this. I didn't have one and didn't want to necessarily buy one just for this step at this point, so I decided the blue ink would look nice. For the base, I take Agaris Dunes. I really like this step because it shows me that if I apply the basing texture, which in this case is Vallejo Dark Earth paste, it dries with this texture, then you prime with your white or light colors, let's say Gracie or something like that, and you get it all over the base too. Then this creates this really nice opportunity to use the contrast paints for the base. I almost am tempted to do a video about this because it seems at first like contrast paints would just be useful for the miniature, but as I applied it over this texture, it created just the right earth tone I was looking for and a nice amount of, you know, shading and highlighting on it. Later on, I do come back and do a little bit of dry brush, but it's mostly done just with that one coat. Now I take Basilicanum Gray and I'm applying it. We're going to do the Smoke Bomb, which is a little bit purple and a little bit gray, and the smoky gray part is going to be on that end of it, the bubbly sort of end of it. And so I just applied it over top to gray it, and then you know, create some deeper, darker shadows. But you can see I'm wicking up the pooling a fair bit because you don't want it to be too black and too heavy-handed. So just want to create some definition in the billows of smoke. The weapon handles, the wooden parts, super easy. I just took Cygor Brown and just did like one coat over top. Working pretty quickly, so you don't see, you know, you don't get lots of streaking and brush strokes. But I found that once it dried, it looked very nice and natural. Just a quick shot to show how things are shaping up so far. The flesh is really going to make these pop and really come together when we get to that step. But first we're working on that smoke bomb a little bit more. I'm going to use Magos Purple, which is a lighter, more pinkish purple. And we're going to run that from basically from the opening of that gold bottle thing he's carrying, or smoke bomb. And just same thing as before, just kind of overlapping it towards the gray so that eventually it's going to blend in with it, because we're also going to blend the gray and this color with the Shyish purple in the middle at a subsequent step. Yeah, so here's where I dry brush a little bit lighter tone, in this case Karak stone, onto the basing, which helps bring out a little bit more of that texture, and kind of lighten it a little bit, I think, which helps. And then I think in some of the other ones I've done since then, I've used Ushapti bone, also looks nice. Very simple step, just try not to get the bone color on the feet. So to highlight the gold, I added some Retributor armor into my palette well, and added some Radiant Platinum from P3. There's times when Radiant Platinum works really well for certain kinds of brown toned armors, or metallic, sorry. And I don't know, it wasn't quite working for me here. I wasn't adding enough or whatever, it just wasn't lightening it enough. So I put quite a bit, and eventually I do go in and just add a drop of silver to really lighten it up, because I wanted, you know, especially those faceplates to really have a nice bright highlight, just like they do in the official paint job. And using a little water again to keep it flowing smoothly without totally breaking up the particles. You can see how I highlight the forehead per se, and the lower jaw area, and then that edge along the front, and then all the edging around the helmet trim. Once again, watching out for your Colorshift paint so you don't get any on there, and any other trim that seems like it needs a highlight of this, but wanting to go up to a nice smooth bright highlight to make sure that the focus is going to stay on their faces with that bright shine. Yeah, so here I decide to add the Mithril Silver. A Stormhost Silver would be similar. Arguably, I lighten it so much that it's almost too much, but I think it turned out okay based on how I kept it fairly thin and layered it on in a couple coats. And just apply it to your liking. And I would say you can skip that Radiant Platinum step, because I think that this silver brightened it up enough that you don't even need that previous step I just did. So I mentioned before, we're going to use that Shyish purple in between the Magos purple and the Basilicanum gray to kind of blend the purple towards the darker gray color of the smoke bomb. Works pretty well, I think. And I wipe it off with my finger when I think it's a little too heavy-handed, and I want that sort of grayish tone to show through of the smoke. Now back to some Mithril Silver or Stormhost Silver. And I'm just going to apply that silver to every single one of these dangly eye things, these little ornamentations they have. They have them all over the place, so be very thorough in looking for them. On weapons, and sometimes there's larger areas that I thought would be suitable, like on this particular headpiece. And this is because I'm planning to use the Gemstone Effect paint, that it's a technical paint from GW, to do like a gem effect rather than painting 50 different gems. This step is important now, because before we do the flesh, we want to go through and clean up every single mess we made on the skin areas. That includes when we got inks on them, when the strap thing didn't work out and a little bit too much black bled through. And so, because what you're trying to do is you're trying to restore the area where the skin contrast paint is going to go, and so that it's not going to have all kinds of dark blobs showing through where it shouldn't. And so you don't have dark colors going outside the lines. I think you get what I mean. I decided to use Gray Sear as a fairly good coverage kind of paint. Like it's, it strikes me as something that's going to cover up the dark spots pretty well. However, it is gray, and I was primed in white, and it did show too much of a difference. So I just mixed that Gray Sear with a bit of my original primer, and it worked out pretty good. This step should have been tedious, but unlike the straps, I found it quite cathartic to go through and just repair any little blobs here and there. I just found it was really starting to make the miniature look finished somehow. Often the cleanup step or the fix-it step is actually really satisfying with miniatures, and it actually goes a long way towards making a good paint job great, is being willing to go back and fix mistakes. And I did use that same mix to go back and neaten up and fix up the white internal, like the inside of his cape robe thingy was supposed to be white, and I had painted it with that dark turquoise, and I decided I wanted it to be the light color. So you can see it was very awkwardly and with difficulty trying to get my brush in there and trying to get a thin coat down without making giant brush strokes, and it just wasn't looking great. So it took me a little while to get this right. So you can save yourself a lot of time if you don't apply this ink over the inside of his coat cloak thing. And yeah, I don't think I show it here, but I did definitely 2 or 3 thin coats to get it neat. And then eventually I was like, that's good enough. So yeah, the step that we've been waiting for that really pulls this whole thing together is the flesh. And I'm using Guilliman flesh, Guilliman. And right out of the pot, I rarely am using it with the medium these days so far. And just take a brush that's the right size to be able to get the tip in between those straps and any of the the folds of the cloth that they're wearing where there's little strips of skin showing. You're going to need a brush that's going to get in there, because you want to try and not get this flesh tone on the cloth that you've painted previously. It's less of a problem if it gets on the black straps, because it's going to just create a little darker spot on a black strap, and that's okay. This really pulls it all together. I really like how this turned out. It's a really good flesh tone. And you want to apply it such that you're going to watch for any of those dark pools and just wick that up with your brush so you don't get like a giant super dark blob, on the inside of their elbow or something like that. Just keep an eye as you're applying it. It goes on really nice, and it really, I think, pulls the whole color scheme together. Now we go back to all the little ornaments we painted with the silver, taking Waystone green and just applying it in a bit of a blob over top of each one. I went back and watched Duncan's Warhammer TV video on how to use this, and I found it a little challenging to do on these horizontally oriented gems, which is basically all of them. So in the end, what I was mostly doing is applying a thin layer and then blobbing some on the upper, kind of like the upper right corner. And I found that worked out pretty well. Oh, so yeah, I do use some technical medium for a change. In this case, it's with the Apothecary White. So what I've done is I've got his bottom cloak area done in a nice white. I've restored, cleaned up any mess that I had made on it with the previous mix. And then I am thinning this because it is a little bit going to turn the white gray as you apply over top. So it's a little heavy, so I did thin it and just mostly painted it into the areas that were folds in the cloak, as opposed to just slathering it all over, which I felt was probably going to make it too gray and make it too kind of messy looking. So I am being a little more targeted with the application of this. Really nice stuff for shading white, though, I think you'll find. So here they are. I threw on some tufts and painted the rims black on their bases. You can hopefully see some of the color shift effect on the turntable, a little bit on the weapons, a little bit on the headdress or headpiece. If you varnish these, be very careful. I would not just blast them with matte varnish. I think it'll wreck the color shift paint effect. You could hand paint it or just carefully airbrush it onto things like their purple plumes or on the cloth and flesh areas, but watch out for the metallics.